Well, thank you for coming today. Today, Senator Heinrich and I will introduce legislation to clarify that anyone convicted of the charge of domestic violence should not be able to purchase firearms. That is currently the law. However, due to this domestic violence loophole, the gunman in this week's tragic shooting in Sutherland Springs was able to obtain a firearm that he ultimately used in this horrific event. Now, outside of the military, domestic violence charges are sent to the National Instant Criminal Background Checks, or the NICS system. But since the military has no defined charge under the Uniform Code of Military Justice for domestic violence, convictions in military courts have gone unreported. This egregious oversight has allowed individuals such as the Texas shooter, who otherwise should not have been able to legally purchase a firearm, to do so. Now, for those who say that this is currently the law, we don't need to change anything or clarify. Since the modern recording or the modern record keeping for NICS began in 2007, there has only been one instance, just one instance of military reporting, such as reporting a charge like this to the database. The military during that time has reported, I think, 12,000 people being dismissed or discharged with a dishonorable discharge. That prevented them from obtaining a firearm. But just one report, just one from 2007 until today, or through 2016, of anybody of a domestic violence charge. And now the Lautenberg Amendment of 1996 had similar intentions as the legislation today, but it clearly has not been effectively applied with regard to military justice. As I mentioned, the Uniform Code of Military Justice does not include specific crimes of domestic violence, which complicates full cooperation between the military and the Department of Justice. So this legislation, and Senator Heinrich will explain it further, simply clarify and force the military to actually categorize or take anything that would have been a domestic violence conviction in a state court and report it as such to the NICS system. Senator Heinrich.
Thank you, Senator Flake. And I just want to start by saying how our hearts go out to the families and friends of these victims. This is something we've seen all too often in our country in recent years. And while there's a lot to disagree on, and our colleagues typically do, when it comes to gun policy, I want to say, as somebody who probably owns a lot more firearms than most of my colleagues on either side of the aisle, that this is exactly the kind of individual who should have never passed a background check. Unfortunately, this individual lived in New Mexico for a time. He was discharged based on activity at Holloman Air Force Base that should have been absolutely disqualifying to be able to purchase a firearm in the first place. We've seen from the data that clearly the intent of the original Lautenberg Amendment is not being implemented effectively, and I think this legislation creates an effective procedure and clear lines of authority and oversight to fix that problem, including an audit by the IG and the GAO that will certify that this is actually getting done now. You have anything to add?
Questions?
Senator Flake?
Yes.
So the process that this legislation would replace would ask the military to create a new code, or just to make sure that they classify any domestic violence? Like, what is the actual mechanism?
Right now, military, in the Uniform Code of Military Justice, there's just a classification for assault. And it seems that because that is the case, they aren't forwarding those convictions to the NICS system, and they aren't being entered in. This would say that if it would have been categorized in state court as a conviction for domestic assault, then it needs to be reported as such. And so and then following up with accountability measures to make sure that it's being done. But it's clearly the case that, since 2007, only one case. So unless we're to assume that there have been no domestic, or only one case of domestic violence in the military over that period of time, then we have a problem. We have a loophole here that needs to be closed.
Why would you stop this at just domestic assault and now broaden it to assault in general or any other classifications?
I think this is something that we clearly had agreement on out of the gate, and it's what we can address and will address right now. I think we're going to be looking at a number of other issues, and we will take those one at a time individually to determine whether there are other things that can and should be done. But this is clearly a loophole that is a problem, and we wanted to move forward and send a message that that folks on both sides of the aisle can come to some agreement on some common sense measures that would make a material difference.
Let me just follow up on that. I think you said it just right. We're often asked after a tragedy like this, why can't you do anything to fix it? We're looking at specifically something that, had it been followed, this person would not have been able to obtain a firearm. And so we are fixing the problem here, and it is something that I think we can have agreement on and move forward and actually get done. And so I think we ought to do it.
What are you concerned about?
There are lots of other things that are going to be debated around here, but we're not going to let the perfect be the enemy of the good here.
Yeah.
We have something we can accomplish. We think we can garner some broad support for, and we're going to move forward on that.
Is there a reactive approach, though? Do you have any concerns that you could see then another incident happen with an individual? I mean, I see what you're saying, but this really isn't a proactive, it's a reactive approach. Are you not concerned about preventing future incidents from happening, possibly from a different?
I think we're both concerned at doing something that we can do right now. There are a lot of things that that we could, conceivably do and pass legislation on in the future, but this is something we can do right now and should do right now. And it would have, this person would not have been able to get a gun if this had been applied before.
To get the military to report, and also if there is something that they need to do in the uniform code, do you feel though that this is a problem on their end, that why were they asleep at the switch? Senator McCain had suggested earlier today that this might be a consequence of sequestration, that there's, military keeps being asked to do more and more, and this would just be one more.
I'm not a fan of sequestration, but I think it's clear from the data that this had nothing to do with sequestration. This is a problem that existed long before sequestration and has been with us ever since. We need a clear procedure for looking at these convictions and reporting them in a timely and accurate fashion so that they end up in the NICS database. And that is not too much to ask. If that had happened, there'd be a whole lot of folks who would still be around right now, potentially. This is something that can make a material difference, and we should put.
Why do you, follow on that question, why do you think is it that these incidents aren't getting reported? Is it because the law is not explicit,
Yeah.
the lack of resources?
I think if you look at the number that have been reported, just one since a modern reporting period, since 2007, it's likely that the period since the Lautenberg Amendment was adopted in 1996 is probably similar. I think it's quite clear it's because they don't classify domestic assault as you do in state court. They only have a classification for assault, and that's a broader classification, and I think it's quite clear that they simply weren't sending those assault records through to the NICS.
Senator, so 2 questions. Who would make the determination in terms of categorizing it as domestic abuse as a state charge? And then also secondarily, would this also apply, would you go back into previous offenses by did those who have been discharged in the past and try to categorize those as well so that they would also be added to this NICS system as well?
I think DOD will have to write regulations for exactly how that would be looked at under state court and then reported to the next database. And then it would be the line of responsibility would go to the secretary, who would have to say, yes, we are meeting this reporting requirement, and we are meeting it in a timely way.
And answer that question too, in terms of retroactivity, then yes, our understanding is that they would take the records that they have, and if there were convictions that would have been domestic violence convictions in a state court, then they would send those records through. Is that correct? Yes.
Is there also a question to, with just classify someone as being dishonorably discharged versus bad conduct, which is what the Texas shooter had? Because some other senators have said they don't understand why this guy wasn't technically dishonorably discharged. What he did seems pretty worthy of that.
I think it's a fair question. I think we don't know the answer to that necessarily just yet. Some of the things that led to him being discharged, I find it shocking that he only did a year. But we're trying to get at the underlying issue of how he got a gun. And that's what this is designed to address.
In putting this together, have you discerned any pockets of opposition, people you've talked to?
Just general, I mean, you look out on social media, and just an announcement that we were doing it, some people are saying it's already the law, and the law simply wasn't followed. It is clear that this is not just a case of the law not being followed. When you only have one instance since 2007 of a domestic violence conviction being reported by the military, there's a problem deeper than just the law not being followed. It's more of a problem with labeling of how these charges or convictions are labeled and how they're recorded.
Senator Cornyn is looking at a different bill but also related to background checks. Have you guys talked at all about combining it?
I've had a very preliminary conversation with Senator Cornyn on the floor earlier today, and we'll be sharing our language with him. And I look forward to seeing what he pursues as well, and we'll just have to see where those conversations lead.
And on a separate gun-related matter, what are your positions on advancing legislation that would restrict bump stocks, as we saw in the Las Vegas shooting?
My purpose, Martin can speak as well, but if the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms is not able to classify these devices that make a semi-automatic weapon, for all intents and purposes, act like a fully automatic weapon, then we ought to pursue legislation. That's my view. And I
think there is no legal rationale for the existence of those devices.
Again, kind of building up that, again, when you saw from Las Vegas with the bump stocks legislation, it was again legislation that was trying to be pushed after this incident had occurred. You know, we've seen two of the deadliest mass shootings in American history. What has to change to where either the Republicans or the Democrats, or how you guys can work together to do a broader reform to address so many of these lingering issues that folks say are directly causing these mass shootings?
Well, I think what we don't want to fall into the trap of, if we can't agree on everything, that we shouldn't do anything. And the reason we're standing here today is to start a conversation about doing something that will make a material difference.
think if Republicans and Democrats will go to a faraway island and survive for a week together, then that certainly helps. Thank you. One more, I'm sorry.
Turning it around for a second, will there be some sort of way for someone who's been placed on this list to appeal to have their name removed? And would that have to go through the UCMJ or some sort of post-military court filing?
I'm not certain about that. I'll defer to counsel on that.
Military convictions in military court, so it would be a military appeals process.
Military.
The military appeals process.
These are convictions in military court, so that's the appeal process.
Senator Heinrich, can I just ask you really quickly about, Kelly was escaped from a mental institution?
That's what I understand. So I think I have some notes on it based on what was said by the El Paso Police Department. Reported that Kelly was a patient at a behavioral health hospital in Santa Teresa, which is not far away. after he was caught, quote, sneaking firearms onto Holloman Air Force Base and, quote, attempting to carry out death threats, unquote, against his military chain of command. That's all we know, and that's based on public reports.
Senator Flake, do you have a comment about Martin Heinrich running for your Senate seat?
None at all. Thank you.